The officer's eyes narrowed as he flipped through my passport, and for a second, the entire airport seemed to go silent around me. "This information doesn't match the system," he said flatly, pointing at the address line that had been crossed out and replaced with something else. My stomach lurched. That wasn't my handwriting. That wasn't my address. Somehow, my life had been altered on paper without me knowing. I tried to keep my face neutral, but my hands gave me away. They trembled as I handed over the secondary ID. My mother's ex-husband's address was the one printed there, though he hadn't lived with us in years. My residence permit file had been rerouted to him. Again. I hadn't authorized this. The man standing at the customs desk didn't know he was unleashing old wounds when he asked, "Who filed your last renewal?" My throat constricted. Who had filed it? My ex-stepfather. Not me. Not my mother. Him. Someone who no longer had any legal claim to me at all, except in the paperwork that chained me to his shadow. I could almost hear his voice in my head, smug as always. "Don't worry, I'll handle it. You'll mess it up." And now, standing there in front of the officer, I realized the scope of his manipulation wasn't just paternal fussiness. It was control. Public, bureaucratic control that left me powerless at the very checkpoint that determined if I could board my flight. The officer motioned me aside for secondary review. Passengers behind me shifted impatiently, but all I felt was heat rising up my neck, embarrassment bleeding into anger. How could he still be doing this, years after leaving my mother, years after leaving us? But the real sting was this. I remembered clear as day, telling him months ago that I wanted my own copy of the immigration folder. He'd shrugged and said he'd keep it safe. Now that folder, my life, my freedom, was in his hands, not mine. I wanted to protest, to scream to the officer that none of this was my fault, but the truth pressed down like a judgment. I had let him hold on to those documents too long. I had trusted that one day he'd step back, and he never did. And as I sat in the cold plastic chair of that sterile airport review room, it dawned on me with horrifying clarity. If he could still reach into my future through a single form, what else had he decided without telling me? I wasn't just stuck in the checkpoint. I was stuck in his grip all over again. And that was only the beginning of what I was about to uncover. Shall I write the next chapter? I couldn't stop replaying the officer's words in my head as I sat there waiting. "Who filed your last renewal?" The truth was, I had never really filed my own renewal. He always did. And in that small, humiliating moment, I realized just how deeply I was still entangled with my mother's ex-husband. To understand how I ended up here, being treated like a child at 26 years old, you need to know how the arrangement began. When my mom remarried him, I was still a teenager. He presented himself as this savior, someone who would stabilize our lives, handle the complicated paperwork, make sure the family got their green cards. My mom was charmed, relieved even. She let him take the wheel because she thought he was a man who knew how to navigate the system. Once he started, he never let go. Every form, every renewal, every immigration update passed through his hands first. At family gatherings, he'd brag about it, like he was the magnanimous patriarch who had, single-handedly, given us a future. It became his favorite story to tell. To friends, to extended relatives, even in church. And each time, I stayed quiet. Because how do you argue against paperwork no one actually saw? Even after the divorce, after his things were cleared out of our home, and the shouting between him and my mom finally stopped vibrating through the walls, he insisted that some things remain under his management. Immigration, he said, was too delicate to turn over to amateurs. Amateurs, meaning me and my mother. Despite the fact that I was old enough to drive, vote, and pay bills, I was still treated as the child who might accidentally get herself deported if he didn't keep his steady hand on the wheel. And the dirty secret is, I allowed it. Because each year, when renewal time came around, I didn't want to be the one to screw it up. What if I missed a detail? What if I filled out the wrong form? Then I'd be the daughter who ruined everything. And he, loud and smug on the sidelines, would be proven right. So I let him stay. But sitting alone in that cold side room of the airport, I realized this wasn't just about fear of deportation anymore. It was about ownership. He had turned my identity, my very permission to live in this country, into a prop to reinforce his own image of competence. And worse, my mother had allowed him to do it. It was a trap disguised as help. A leash I'd never noticed tightening until I was choking on it. And if you're shaking your head right now, thinking it couldn't get worse, wait until you hear how he used even the smallest, pettiest details of that control to humiliate me at home. That's when the cracks in his nice guy mask first started to show. Shall I write the next chapter? It always started small. That's what still haunts me. The way control seeped in, drop by drop, disguised as fatherly fussing. When I first asked him for a copy of my papers at 17, he smirked and told me, "What for? You're just going to lose them." He said it in front of my mom, like it was a harmless joke, and she laughed nervously while I flushed with shame. I remember slinking back to my room, trying not to let them see my eyes sting. Then came the delays. If I needed a document for school, say, proof of residency for a scholarship application, I had to beg. He wouldn't hand it over right away. "I'll get around to it," he'd say, tossing the request aside like I was asking for a ride to the mall. Sometimes it took weeks, and by then, I'd already missed a deadline. But the worst were the reminders that I owed him. Anytime I dared to argue with him about chores or curfews, he'd lean back in his chair, fold his arms, and say, "Careful. Don't forget who made sure you stayed in this country." He didn't have to raise his voice. The implication alone pressed like a rock against my chest. And my mom, always anxious to keep the peace, would hush me with a look. One of those don't start glances that said she'd give anything to avoid another storm. I convinced myself that enduring these small humiliations was worth it if it meant security. But each little micro-injustice added up, shaping me into someone who felt ungrateful the moment I wanted control over my own life. Do you know what it feels like to be treated like a guest in your own existence? Like your right to belong is on loan, renewable only under their supervision. Still, I told myself his digs were normal. Maybe even love in a twisted form. Other people didn't see the tension beneath his jokes. To them, he was responsible, steady, even caring. That was the script he wrote for himself, and he played it well. But beneath the safe exterior were cracks no one wanted to acknowledge. And when I finally tried to step forward and reclaim even a sliver of agency, he didn't just resist. He turned the whole situation against me. And the way he did it, the words he used, the way he made me look like the ungrateful villain, still echo in my ears. Shall I write the next chapter? When I finally gathered the courage to tell him I wanted to take control of my own immigration documents, I rehearsed the words over and over in my head. I thought if I spoke calmly, if I came to him like an adult instead of the teenager he was used to controlling, maybe he'd listen. I remember sitting across from him at my mom's kitchen table. He still dropped by sometimes, even after the divorce, like the house was a revolving door he never fully exited. I'd placed my laptop on the table, with the immigration website already pulled up. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it between my teeth. "I think I'm ready to handle the renewals myself from now on," I said, carefully measuring each word. At first, he didn't react at all. He just chewed on his toast slowly, like I hadn't spoken. Then, without looking up, he gave this half laugh, like I'd just told him I planned to fly to Mars. "Handle it yourself?" he finally muttered. He leaned back in his chair and squinted at me. "You don't even know which form is which. Do you want to risk getting deported over pride?" I swallowed hard. "I've been reading the requirements. I can—" He cut me off with a raised hand. "Stop. Don't embarrass yourself. Do you realize how serious this is? Immigration doesn't look kindly on mistakes. You mess one thing up, and it's over." My mom walked in at that moment, drying her hands on a towel, and my eyes silently begged her to back me up. Instead, she sighed. "Honey, he's only trying to help. Why pick a fight? You should be grateful he's willing to keep doing this for you." Grateful. That word burned. I wanted to scream. Grateful for being treated like a child? Grateful for being painted as incompetent before I'd even tried? He shook his head, as if he was the weary adult in the room, and I was a brat stomping my feet. "You want to live here, don't you? Then let me do what I've always done." His tone was final, dismissive. Like this wasn't a negotiation, just a petulant request he was shutting down. And just like that, the conversation was over. My mom patted my shoulder half-heartedly and whispered, "Don't make this into a bigger issue. Be smart." But deep down, something snapped in me that day. I realized this wasn't about his knowledge, or even about me making a mistake. This was about dominance. Every time I tried to claim space, he twisted it until I looked reckless, selfish, or flat-out stupid. The gaslighting left me questioning whether maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't capable. But the first time he did it publicly, in front of people who could see my cheeks burn under the weight of his words, that was when the shame turned to rage. And that moment happened during a family dinner that I will never forget. Shall I write the next chapter? It was a Sunday dinner at my aunt's house, the kind of gathering where food covered every surface and laughter bounced off the walls. I had promised myself I'd keep things neutral, keep my head down, just make it through without any tension. But I should have known he wouldn't let it pass. We were midway through dessert when he leaned back in his chair, swirling his coffee like a man winding up for a performance. "You know," he said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "if it weren't for me, she'd still be fumbling through forms, probably missing deadlines." His eyes flicked to me, and that smirk, the one I dreaded, spread across his face. Good thing someone competent stepped in. The table chuckled politely. My aunt laughed outright. My cousins glanced at me with raised brows, half smiling like it was all harmless fun. But inside, I froze. My cheeks burned as though all the heat in the room had collapsed onto me. I tried to defend myself. "Actually, I've been learning how to handle things on my own." He tilted his head and gave me this mock surprised look. "Oh, really?" he drawled. "Then why did you call me in a panic about the residency card renewal? Remember? You didn't even know which office processed it." That wasn't what happened. I had asked him a simple question about mailing addresses, but he twisted it into a full-scale rescue in his own retelling. People laughed again. "She's lucky to have you," one relative said through a mouthful of pie. I looked down at my plate, suddenly nauseated. Words wouldn't come. My mom cleared her throat and murmured something about gratitude again. But my cousin, quiet throughout most of the evening, leaned over and slid his phone under my elbow. A text glowed on the screen. "He loves this too much. Don't let him own your story." I blinked, cheeks hot, throat tight. It meant someone else finally saw what I saw. That this wasn't care. This wasn't responsibility. It was theater. A way for him to keep me small, to be the reliable savior everyone else clapped for. I laughed weakly along with the others, but in my head, I was screaming. How could I get untangled from his grip if even my family bought into his performance? That night, when I got home, I couldn't swallow the shame any longer. I opened my laptop, determined to make an appointment with an immigration lawyer. Not to spite him, but to finally prove to myself that I could handle my own future. But what I discovered at that appointment stopped me dead in my tracks. Shall I write the next chapter? I walked into the lawyer's office, clutching my folder like a lifeline. It wasn't much, just the duplicate copies he'd occasionally allowed me to have, shoved together in a flimsy envelope. I thought if I explained to the lawyer that I wanted to transfer everything to my own address, to finally cut the cord from my mother's ex, it would be a straightforward process. The lawyer was kind at first. She listened patiently, nodding as I explained that for every renewal, every form, every notice, it was always him, not me, and how I wanted that to end. Of course, she said, tapping her pen against her legal pad, we'll just need to check your current file status online so we can initiate the change. She slid her laptop toward me. I typed in my case number with my pulse thudding in my temples. The screen loaded, and there it was. My stomach sank. My address had been listed as his. His name was still attached as the guardian applicant. The last renewal wasn't even filed under my login credentials. It was filed with his email. The lawyer frowned. Wait, this shouldn't be possible. Guardianship authorization usually expires once the child is over 18, or if the sponsor divorces the parent. Unless, she trailed off, clicking rapidly through the pages. Then she stopped and looked at me carefully. He pre-filed as your official point of contact. My heart hammered. What does that mean? It means, she said slowly, that as of right now, all official correspondence is still going to him. Every notice, every update. Legally, you'd have to take deliberate steps to revoke it. And because he got there first, that revocation might be complicated. Her words crashed over me like cold water. He hadn't just helped. He'd ensured I couldn't move forward without him. An invisible chain wrapped around my ankle, tethering me back to him every time I thought I was free. I want it revoked, I said, louder than I meant to. My hands were fists on the desk. I want him out of my file. The lawyer nodded, sympathetic but cautious. We can start the process, but it may take a few months. And depending on how he described the circumstances, it could get messy. There might be resistance. Resistance. From him. Always him. I left the office nauseous, the city streets blurring as I walked. And later that week, when I tried to breathe through the anger, my phone buzzed with an email that made my blood run cold. It wasn't even supposed to come to me. It was his message, accidentally forwarded. And that's when I realized just how far he'd gone to keep me under his thumb. Shall I write the next chapter? The email came late at night while I was halfway through folding laundry on my bed. I almost ignored the notification, but the subject line caught my eye. Residency renewal, mailing address confirmed. It wasn't even addressed to me. The only reason I got it was because he'd misclicked while forwarding a chain to himself. I opened it. My chest tightened with every line I read. There it was, in black and white. He had deliberately listed his own address as the official residence of record on my file. Not only that, he wrote a smug little note to the immigration officer explaining that I preferred he handle correspondence because she is prone to misplacing documents. My stomach flipped. That wasn't just a lie. It was character assassination built right into my record. He had told the government I was irresponsible, that I was incapable of managing my life, that without him, I couldn't function. I felt my throat close as I scrolled, my name displayed only as a passive applicant, while his email and address stood boldly in the contact fields. For years, he'd gaslighted me in private. He'd told me I wasn't ready, that I'd mess it all up, and now I saw the horrifying truth. He hadn't just said it to me. He'd written it down for institutions to accept as fact. He had turned his condescension into official testimony. I could barely breathe. How many officers, how many administrators had looked at my file and silently judged me as the child who needed her ex-stepfather to manage her affairs? No wonder the officer at the airport had looked at me the way he did, as though I wasn't even a real adult. I forwarded the email to myself, my hands shaking. Proof. I finally had proof of what he was doing. Proof that I wasn't paranoid, that I wasn't misinterpreting kindness. This had never been help. This was control, carefully cemented into bureaucracy, ensuring that even when he no longer lived under our roof, he still lived in my identity. And at that moment, I knew I couldn't sit quietly anymore, not after seeing in writing how he defined me to the outside world. The next morning, staring at that email again, I made a decision. If he wanted to paint me like I was irresponsible, then I was going to confront him with the only thing he'd never expected me to have: evidence. And what happened at that confrontation, it would change the balance of my family forever. Shall I write the next chapter? I didn't sleep the night before the confrontation. The email sat on my phone screen like a flashing warning light. Every sentence burned into my brain. By sunrise, I had stopped feeling afraid. The fear had flipped into something sharper, heavier, like a blade being drawn from a sheath. I messaged my mom first, asking if she could meet me at the visa office. I didn't tell her why. I knew she'd resist if I tipped her off. She still clung to this fantasy that her ex-husband was just helpful, that his involvement was nothing more than an old habit. But deep down, I suspected she knew. She just didn't want to face it. When I arrived at the office, he was already there. Of course he was. Sitting tall in the waiting area, holding a leather folder that looked almost identical to the one he used to carry during their marriage. My mother sat beside him, wringing her hands like a nervous accomplice. The sight almost broke me. "Why did you call this meeting?" he asked as soon as I approached, his voice casual, but his eyes smirking with that subtle warning, "Don't test me." I didn't answer. Instead, I looked straight at the clerk when my number was called. "I'm here about my file," I said, my voice louder than I expected. We sat at the desk as the clerk pulled up my information. My ex-stepfather leaned forward instantly, speaking for me like he always did. "Yes, I manage her paperwork. Address is current, renewals on schedule." "Stop." My own voice cut through his like glass. The clerk stared at me in surprise. My mother shifted uncomfortably. I pulled out my phone and slid it across the counter. The email shimmered on the screen, the lies plain for everyone to read. "I didn't authorize this," I said, each word deliberate. "He told immigration I can't manage my own documents. He listed his address, not mine. He's been controlling my file without my consent." The clerk read in silence, then slowly turned to him. "Sir, are you her legal guardian?" He opened his mouth, hesitated, then bristled. "Well, no, not anymore. But she needs supervision. She doesn't understand the system." "That's enough." My voice was steady now, ringing with everything I'd held back for years. "You're not my guardian. You're not my father. You're my mother's ex. And you don't get to own my life anymore." The clerk nodded firmly, tapping the keyboard. "We'll update the records now. All correspondence will go directly to you, miss. Effective immediately." My ex-stepfather's face reddened, his control crumbling in front of witnesses. "You'll regret this," he spat softly. My mom reached for my wrist under the table, whispering frantically, "Why are you doing this? You're humiliating him." Humiliating him? The words felt like a slap. But I didn't falter. I signed the papers the clerk slid across the counter, my hands steady as ink pressed into official record. For the first time, someone was seeing me as an adult in my own right, not as baggage dragged around by his ego. The silence afterward was louder than any shouting match. But what I didn't anticipate was the fallout. The ways he would lash out, the cracks that would ripple through the family as a result of me finally severing his grip. And the moment we walked out of that office, it began. Shall I write the next chapter? The doors of the visa office shut behind us with a metallic thud, and I swear the air outside felt heavier than the stale fluorescent-lit waiting room. My mom's heels clicked frantically against the pavement as she tried to keep up with me. "You didn't have to do it like that," she hissed, more worried about him than about the fact that my identity had been hijacked for years. I turned to face her, hot tears prickling my eyes. Didn't have to do it like what? Standing up for myself? Taking back my own life? My voice rose despite the knot in my throat. Mom, he lied about me. He wrote to the government that I'm irresponsible. Don't you understand what that means? He was defining me as incompetent to people who decide if I get to stay in this country. Behind us, he finally caught up, his jaw tight, eyes glinting with fury. "You embarrassed me in front of officials," he seethed. His voice was low, but the venom in it made my skin crawl. "Do you really think you can handle this yourself? Do you know how complicated these systems are? How unforgiving? The second you screw up, don't come crawling back to me." I laughed bitterly, though it sounded broken. I'd rather screw up on my own than live like this, like I'm some child you control with a stack of documents. My mom flinched at the word control, but she didn't argue. She just stared at the ground, her silence more cutting than any accusation. Later that night, the fallout spread through the family like wildfire. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Some relatives said I was disrespectful. Others asked why I would attack the man who helped raise me. But then there were quieter, more private messages, the kind whispered in shadows of family group chats. "I've seen how he talks to you. He always made things about himself. Maybe you finally did the right thing." The split lines were drawn sharper than ever before, and I was at the center, no longer invisible. For the first time, people had to pick a side, and not all of them picked him. But he wasn't done. His pride was too wounded to let this lie. A week later, I got an envelope in the mail. Inside was a photocopy of my old visa paperwork, with a note in his unmistakable handwriting. "You'll regret cutting me out. Don't say I didn't warn you." I held that paper in my hands, my blood pounding. It was a threat and a promise. And in that moment, I knew the fight wasn't over. The question was, how much more was the family willing to tolerate before they finally saw him for what he really was? Shall I write the next chapter? The note burned in my hands long after I'd read it. "You'll regret cutting me out." That wasn't just bitterness. It was a declaration of war. I sat on my bed, the pile of immigration forms and the forwarded emails sprawled around me like evidence in a crime scene. For years, he had been the one staging the narrative, exaggerating his sacrifices, turning my existence into proof of his competence. But now that the mask had cracked in public, he was cornered, and cornered men lash out. I wanted to tear the note up, to pretend it was just empty bravado, but some instinct told me to keep it. Proof again. By then, I had learned something vital. His greatest weapon was twisting words, framing me as ungrateful. Every piece of evidence mattered. But fear gnawed at me still. What if he had already filed something else in my name? Some renewal or declaration I didn't know about? What if there were traps buried deeper in the system, waiting to go off? That night, anxiety kept me pacing, until I decided to dig. And that's when I remembered. After the office confrontation, he had pumped out a flurry of emails, trying to counter the clerk, CCing my mom, even CCing my aunt for transparency. I hadn't read them closely at the time. I was too wound up. Now, as I scrolled through them, something caught my eye. One attachment, a scanned page, supposedly summary information from immigration files. Except in the scanned corner was a faint watermark that didn't belong there. My stomach flipped. It wasn't just official paperwork. It was a document he'd manipulated, cobbling together across old forms to make it look like proof of his continued authority. He had forged an illusion of legitimacy, banking on the family never knowing the difference. I stared at that attachment, my hands trembling. There it was, concrete evidence that this wasn't only pettiness or inflated ego. This was active sabotage, him doing whatever he could to maintain a grip that legally didn't even belong to him anymore. That night, something shifted inside me. I wasn't scared anymore. I was furious. For the first time in years, I wasn't just trying to defend myself. I was ready to fight back. And the next morning, with the threat note and the forged document saved side by side, I knew it was time to put both in front of people who mattered. I wasn't going to whisper about what he'd done anymore. I was going to expose him fully. So when the weekend came, and I knew the family would all be together, I brought the folder. And I was ready. Shall I write the next chapter? I walked into my aunt's living room that Saturday, carrying the manila folder like it was a weapon. Inside were the printouts of the forged document, the threatening note he'd mailed me, and the forwarded email where he called me prone to misplacing documents. My hands were shaking, but not from fear this time. It was adrenaline. For the first time, I wasn't showing up to defend myself. I was showing up to expose him. The family was scattered across couches and chairs, plates of food balanced on knees, voices rising and falling in the usual chatter. He was already there, of course, leaning back in his seat with that smug certainty that had always made me clench my teeth. My mom sat beside him, her nervous smile plastered on like a mask, shooting me those invisible please don't start glances. But I didn't hesitate. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to be steady. I need to show you all something. The room quieted slowly, suspiciously. I opened the folder and laid the first page on the coffee table. His fake, summary information. I tapped the corner with the watermark. This is supposed to be my immigration file, except it isn't. He pieced this together to make it look like he's still authorized to handle my documents. My eyes flicked directly to him. That's not just lying, that's interference. He sat forward instantly, his voice dripping with fake laughter. Are you serious? She doesn't even understand what that page means, and now she's calling it forgery? He looked around, searching for allies. This is unbelievable. I didn't flinch. I pulled out the second item, the threatening note. I read it aloud, each word like fire in the room. You'll regret cutting me out. A wave of murmurs rippled through the living room. My aunt's brows furrowed. My cousin, the one who had once texted me under the table, looked at him with open disgust. I saw the shift happening, subtle but undeniable. Finally, I placed the email printout down, the one where he told officials I was careless and irresponsible. This wasn't a private remark. This was submitted to a federal agency. He decided, without asking me, to define me as incapable, to keep control of my entire life under the guise of protection. Silence. It hung sharp in the air. My mother wouldn't look at me. My ex-stepfather's face was red, his jaw tight, his mask slipping inch by inch. When he finally spoke, his voice was not calm or charming anymore. It was raw with rage. Do you realize everything I've done for you? The sacrifices I made? This is how you thank me? In public humiliation? I looked straight at him and said, steady as I'd ever been, no. This is how I end it. The room broke into chaos. Voices overlapping, my mom pleading, my aunt defending me, cousins arguing. Suddenly, The balance of power had shifted. I wasn't the cornered child anymore. The secrets were out in daylight, and everyone had to choose where they stood. But the cost of that moment was higher than I expected. Because once the shouting stopped, lines were drawn that couldn't be erased. And in the days that followed, the fallout came crashing down, not just on him, but on me too. Shall I write the next chapter?